Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use, tips a balance in favor of fair use. Okay, this is from skent.alberta.ca.com. Brainwashing in Scientology's Rehabilitation Project Force. To include children, everyone. Let's not forget. Brainwashing in Scientology's Rehabilitation Project Force. Revised version of a presentation at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, San Diego, California, November 7th, 1997, by Dr. Stephen Kent, University of Alberta, Canada. Drafted December 3rd, 1997. Abstract. This study examines the confinement programs in camps, like the camp Nathan Rich was in, like the camp Mike Brown was in, Lair FM. That Scientology operates as supposedly rehabilitative facilities for deviant members of its elite C organization. These programs, known collectively as the Rehabilitation Project Force, put coerced participants through regimes of harsh physical punishment, forced self-confessions, social isolation, hard labor, and intense doctrinal study, all as part of leadership designed like prestigious executives. Efforts to regain members' ideological commitment. The confinement that participants experience, to include children, combined with forms of physical maltreatment, intensive ideological study, and forced confessions, allow social scientists to speak of the RPF as a brainwashing program. Introduction to the brainwashing debate within the social sciences. 2. RPF accounts in the courts and the media. Methodological issues. Ideational history of the RPF. Hubbard's Brainwashing and Psychopolitics Manual. Hubbard's discussions of brainwashing in the late 1960s. Organizational forerunners to the RPF. The creation of the RPF. The creation of the RPF's RPF. RPF consistencies and variations. 1. Forcible confinement. 1. Forcible confinement. Forcible confinement. Like false imprisonment. 2. Accounts of physical maltreatment. A. Excessive exercise, the running program. B. Physically demanding and tiring chores. C. Poor diet. That's why we're seeing all these people limping and with curved backs. It's from malnutrition. D as in Delta, issues of hygiene and medical care. E as in Echo, sleeping conditions. 3. Social maltreatment. 4. Intensive study of ideology. 5. Forced confessions. Forced confessions of children. 6. Success stories. The impact on some Scientologists who saw the RPF in operation. Conclusion: brainwashing as a practice in Scientology and a concept in sociology. 21. Bibliography. 22. Introduction. As an international institution requiring total compliance from its confined participants, Scientology's Rehabilitation Project Force is unique among contemporary ideological organizations operating in the Western world, while other organizations, such as the Family, the Children of God, have operated analogous programs. See Kenton Hall, 1997. The RPF has existed for over 20 years. Established in January 1974, the RPF is a program of hard physical labor, forced confessions, and intense ideological study. Scientology insists that the program is designed to correct staff members' problems in order to allow them to remain in its elite Sea Org and operate effectively in it. Critics, questioners, insist that its purpose is to break the will of inmates like children, in a manner that minimizes people's abilities to operate outside of the ideological constraints of the organization. They also argue that it provides Scientology with a labor force that receives almost no salaries. In any case, newspapers have reported on the program since at least 1984, with stories appearing in American, British, Danish, and German media. No academic accounts about it exist. However, even though its operation has direct bearing on an issue that many social scientists consider closed, the extent to which so-called new religions utilize brainwashing techniques on their members. This study argues that brainwashing, the systematic, scientific, and coercive elimination of the individuality of the mind of another, is a social, scientifically appropriate concept for analyzing Scientology's imposition of reindoctrination programs within the confinement conditions experienced by inmates in the RPF and its more severe extension, the RPF's RPF. It constructs this argument using primary documents that Scientology's founder L. Ron Hubbard either wrote or disseminated, as well as legal documents, interview transcripts, and media accounts. These documents and other items help identify Scientology's historical and organizational contexts out of which the RPF emerged, and they provide extended glimpses into actual RPF operations in several locations during particular periods. Of special interest to scholars is the study's use of Scientology publications from the mid-1950s and late 1960s that specifically discuss brainwashing techniques. Not only, therefore, is brainwashing an appropriate social scientific term to use when describing the RPF, but also it is a term that coincides with Scientology's own descriptions about forcing attitude change within confined environments. The brainwashing debate within the social sciences. The brainwashing debate in the social sciences took place mostly in the 1980s and early 1990s, when several professional organizations, professors and scholars reacted against American courts, accepting arguments that so-called new religions coerced members into conversion. Much of the sociological attack targeted psychologist Margaret Singer, PhD, who used a coercive persuasion brainwashing model to explain to courts how litigants joined and behaved in the groups they now were suing or defending against. The social scientific attacks concluded that the brainwashing term was valid only if the group in question used incarceration and physical maltreatment against members. In situations of uniform consent, there's no consent in Scientology. This threefold requirement was a minimalist one, since a brainwashing program also would have to include an intense indoctrination program, coupled with personal confessions of past sins. So withholds. Since neither the term supporters or detractors provided concrete evidence that even these minimalist activities uniformly occurred in most groups. Conversion activities, sociologists, and others concluded that brainwashing was not an appropriate term for describing how and why people join new or controversial religions. Of these requirements for using the brainwashing term, the single most important one was extreme physical coercion. If such a condition existed, then it would allow both researchers and the courts to isolate brainwashing from other forms of coercive persuasion. As Robbins and Anthony concluded, without physical force as a boundary, there is no natural or objective cutting point as to when coercive persuasion is potent enough to overcome free will, as the brainwashing model implies. One crucial aspect of brainwashing in litigation has been an effort to specify when courts should allow individuals to use the concept as an excuse for deviant or illegal behavior. Researcher Dick Anthony, often working with associate Tom Robbins, developed much of the theory in this area and served as a consulting expert for lawyers, defending the Unification Church, Scientology, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Transcendental Meditation, and the Community Chapel against brainwashing allegations from disgruntled former members. Anthony and Robbins concluded that some attempts to utilize cult brainwashing to justify exemptions from American constitutional protections of religions presuppose that brainwashing is a form of hard determinism, which assumes that people are confined in ideological systems whose doctrines they must adopt. Human behavior explanations that postulate hard determinism, Anthony and Robbins claim, do not have general or even substantial acceptance in the relevant scientific communities, presumably sociology and psychology, and they are no longer taken seriously in the academic world. Consequently, in future attempts to assess the reassemblance of the theologies of religious groups to totalitarian ideologies, Anthony and Robbins hope that researchers will focus upon the free marketplace of ideas rather than upon increased governmental regulation of religious ideas or on the outcome of trials. In other words, these respected social scientists believe that research into whether religious groups brainwash has concluded that they do not do so, at least in a hard deterministic way, and this conclusion eliminates any need for discussion about governmental or legal intervention against religions on now disproven grounds that they brainwash their members into robots who commit deviant or criminal acts. RPF accounts in the courts and the media. Remarkably, however, throughout much of this debate, the popular press, some court documents, and at least one court appellate decision described the forced confinement, maltreatment, and uniform consent that Sea Org members, Sea Org members are children too. Isn't that wonderful? experienced in Scientology's RPF program and facilities. These descriptions were of a brainwashing program used to retain members rather than to obtain them. And perhaps for this reason, social scientists neglected to address these accounts. The first public statement about the RPF seems to have appeared in a January 25, 1980 affidavit by former member Tanya Burden of Las Vegas, Nevada, who described it as a Scientology concentration camp, and from which she escaped after having been in the program for around 3 months. Former member Jerry Armstrong supported Burden's general description of RPF conditions in a June 1982 affidavit, stating that he personally observed people, people like children, including Tanya Burden in the RPF, sleeping on floors, in storage rooms in the boiler room, and in other subhuman conditions. Just go check out Shane of Australia. He went through that as a child. Armstrong and 2 other former members, Laurel Sullivan and William Franks, spoke harshly about the RPF in a 1984 article in the Florida newspaper, the Clearwater Sun. Franks called it a horrible thing. And Sullivan spoke about how rough the program was, having to work in 120-degree heat with a severe case of colitis. In that same year, Great Britain's The Sunday Times magazine carried RPF descriptions from 3 more former members, Bent Corden, Jay Hurwitz, and David Mayo. Hurwitz said that for the first 5 days, he and others were kept locked up under guard. We were brought our food and we slept on the floor. We had to use the same toilet facilities in the presence of one another. It's just like prison. Hurwitz was the RPF near Gilman Hot Springs, California in the summer of 1982, along with 18 other senior, 18 other senior Scientology staffers. Also in 1984, a British court stated in a written decision that 2 years earlier, a woman in Scientology's English headquarters in East Grinstead was required to do at least 12 hours physical work a day. Imagine the children doing this, you guys. Shifting bricks, emptying bins, which aggravated a chronic back condition. This same story reappeared in the excellent study written by Englishman John Atack in 1990, and then in a newspaper article in 1994. Back in the United States, former member Don Larson told Forbes magazine in 1986 that he alone brought nearly 300 recalcitrant Scientologists to rehabilitation project forces at Scientology centers around the world over a period of 14 months, until his departure in late 1983. In these sadistic detention programs, staff members would be coerced into performing hard labor. They didn't have any choice. Eating leftovers out of buckets. Imagine the children going through this. And sleeping on floors. Some were reportedly kept against their will. All of them were. The year after the Forbes article, British biographer Russell Miller published his account of Hubbard's life, which contained nearly a dozen references to the RPF. A 1989 California appellate court decision indicated that continuously for 3 weeks, former Scientologist Larry Wollersheim had been baited and badgered to enter the RPF, which the judge mentioned as evidence that Wohlersheim accepted some of his auditing, religious counseling, under threat of physical coercion. The accounts of Frank Sullivan and former Sea Org staff member Hannah Whitfield appeared again in a series on the organization that the Los Angeles Times published in 1990. The article indicated that the RPF provides the church with a pool of labor to perform building maintenance. Let's get it out there that there's children in this pool of labor. To perform building maintenance, pull weeds, haul garbage, clean toilets, or do anything else church executives, church prestigious executives, deemed necessary for redemption. In the same year as the Los Angeles Times series, John Atak's thorough study of his former group. What was John Atak in Scientology for 2 years? Something like that. John Atak's thorough study of his former group contained significant RPF information. Did he talk about the children? Finally, as recently as 1996, the RPF received attention in a Scientology study produced by former member Bent Cordon, himself having been an RPF inmate. Taken together, these legal and media sources strongly suggest that the RPF is a brainwashing facility, according to the requirements that Anthony and Young and Griffith specify, but no social scientists pursued an investigation. They're not allowed in there. That's why. Methodological issues. Perhaps one reason that social scientists have not examined the brainwashing dynamics of the RPF is because its study presents some unusual methodological obstacles that they must overcome in order to obtain appropriate information. First, Scientology has made out-of-court settlements with former RPF victims, and these settlements include agreements. Oh, there's the NDA, you guys. Isn't Rinder big on NDAs? That they will not speak critically and publicly against the organization. I know of at least 5 people, 2 Americans, 2 Canadians, and 1 New Zealander, who entered into such agreements. All those non-disclosure agreements need to be nullified. Second, Scientology keeps confidential the key series of documents that define the RPF's operation. These documents appear in the Flag Order 3434 series, containing at least 56 separate issues. 56 is a Jesuit number. And only a small number of them have leaked out to researchers. Consequently, it remains impossible to trace the development of the RPF program through the organization's most relevant documents, which means that scholars' best information sources remain the accounts of former members. Third, former members who went through the RPF are difficult to find, and once found, often are reluctant to speak with a researcher. The difficulty of finding former RPF inmates stems partly from the fact that the program's design is to feed repentant, and some would say emotionally broken, Sea Org members back into the organization. Consequently, many potential informants remain in Scientology under threat. You guys, who does this sound like? Sea Org members and some would say emotionally broken. Sea Org members back into the... I gotta read this again. The difficulty of finding former RPF inmates stems partly from the fact that the program's design is to feed repentant, and some would say emotionally broken, Sea Org members back into the organization. Consequently, many potential informants remain in Scientology under threat of being either excommunicated or sent back into the RPF itself for talking negatively about their time in it. Moreover, as RPF participants, children, they spent countless and in some cases hundreds of hours confessing to alleged sins and crimes. See, overts and withholds. And they fear that the organization would use these confessions against them if they were to talk. Indeed, the RPFers who complete their programs must write or sign a statement before they leave which praises the RPF and extols its virtues. For all of these reasons, I did not attempt to interview active Scientologists who had been RPF inmates. Any criticism or negative statements that informants might have made about their experiences likely would have had dire consequences for them. For this study, therefore, I interviewed 6 people who had been on RPFs in different parts of the world. Plus, I collected court documents, affidavits, and correspondence from 14 more. In addition, I interviewed a person who had witnessed the RPF in operation, but had not participated in it, and collected accounts through personal correspondence, anonymous newsgroup postings, and legal documents from 8 additional individuals who also claim to have seen inmates on the program. In addition to the information by and from these 29 people, I collected primary Scientology documents and publications that discuss the RPF, along with accounts of it from the popular press. The picture that emerges from these sources shows variations according to, sometimes important, details, but the overall picture concerning the operation of the program remains remarkably consistent. Ideational history of the RPF. 5. Often overlapping activities of social control seem universal in all of the RPF information that is available from non-Scientology sources. These activities are 1. Forcible confinement. Imagine the children going through this. 2. Physical maltreatment through such things as hard exercise, physically demanding chores. How many times have we heard about the kids that have to run everywhere? Poor diet, limited time for hygiene, and inadequate sleeping arrangements, etc. 3. Social maltreatment through restrictions in verbal and written communication with others. Degradation, very low pay, etc. 4. Intensive study of ideology. And 5. It's when everyone's on course. That's what that is. 5. Forced confessions of past alleged sins. The goal of these activities is the alignment of the RPF inmates with the ideology of Scientology as directed by its leaders. This alignment comes about after the program has eliminated people's abilities or desires to criticize policies or the leaders who oversee their implementation. Remarkably, a 1955 booklet that Hubbard himself almost certainly wrote described psychopolitical techniques of subduing people and populations to totalitarian rule. In some of the techniques foreshadow the RPF policies that subsequently he approved for use against his own elite core. Hubbard's Brainwashing and Psychopolitics Manual. The booklet was entitled Brainwashing, a synthesis of the Russian textbook on psychopolitics, and one version was published as a public service by the Church of Scientology. The introduction purports to be a speech by the famous chief of Soviet secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, to American students at the Lenin University about how to subvert societies through the imposition of psychopolitics on populations through the guise of mental healing. Hubbard just came up with this by himself, I guess. 3. The entire text is fraudulent. Kaminsky, 1970. And all indicators point directly to Hubbard as the author. In any case, Hubbard wrote about the brainwashing booklet to his followers, claiming that unless the basic philosophy of the brainwasher is understood, auditors will have difficulty handling clients who had suffered the techniques. More probably, he was trying to both discredit psychiatry and endear his organization to the American government, with the claim that Dianetics and Scientology could reverse the effects of communist brainwashing and thus was a powerful political tool. Certainly, Hubbard's desire to secure Dianetics and Scientology as a weapon against communism would explain why he wrote the FBI about the booklet in mid-December 1955. You guys, if that doesn't tell you everything, I don't even know what to say. Hubbard was writing the FBI letters. It also would explain why the Church of Scientology published the slim volume as a public service. Back cover of Hubbard, probable author, 1955. Obsessed with issues of controlling and subduing people and nations, the Brainwashing Manual is an extraordinary work. Most probably key ideas that Hubbard presumably wrote about in the Brainwashing Manual, they must have been using that the last, 5 years throughout the world, right? Ante what? You don't have a job? Became policies and procedures. Yeah, they're also unlawful. In the RPF, nearly 20 years later, the manual's own definition of psychopolitics, for example, indicated that it was the art and science of asserting and maintaining dominion over the thoughts and loyalties of individuals, officers, bureau, and masses, and the effecting of the conquest of enemy nations through mental healing. Later, the text presented a strategy for subversives to use in destroying individuals, opposition to the state, and this strategy involved the destruction of any forms of individuality that might foster doubts against the imposing ideology. The tenets of rugged individualism, personal determinism, self-will, imagination, and personal creativeness are alike in the masses antipathetic to the good of the greater state. Oh, where does this... Didn't we hear this over and over? There's several sayings in Scientology that cover this. I believe it's Brave New World. I also believe it is the 1984 doctrine. These willful and unaligned forces are no more than illnesses which will bring about disaffection, disunity, and at length, the collapse of the group to which the individual is attached. Having identified individuality as the threat to the greater state, the solution was simple. It is the mission of psychopolitics, first to align the obedience and goals of the group, and then maintain their alignment by the eradication of the effectiveness of the persons and personalities, which might serve the group toward disaffection. Psychopolitics makes it possible to remove that part of his personality, which by itself is making havoc with the person's own constitution, as well as with the group with which the person is connected. That doesn't scream Charlie Igloo Alpha. In essence, the state had to establish its own goals as the only acceptable ones that destroy aspects of people's personalities. Kind of like what's going on today. That might lead them to individualistic expressions that would be out of alignment with those goals. This outline for totalitarian conformity transformed into the reality of the RPF. Hubbard's discussions of brainwashing in the late 1960s. During the late 1960s, Hubbard discussed brainwashing at least 4 times in various talks and writings, and these discussions always were consistent with the basic techniques of personality destruction and goals realignment discussed in the Brainwashing Manual of 1955. The book All About Radiation bridges the 1960s and the 1950s, since Hubbard took his comments from a 1957 Congress on Nuclear Radiation and Health, published them that same year, then reissued the book in 1967. This publication included a section entitled What Brainwashing Is. Brainwashing is a very simple mechanism. One gets a person to agree that something might be a certain way, and then drives him by introverting him and through self-criticism to the possibility that it is that way. Only then does a man believe that the erroneous fact was a truth. By gradient scale of hammering, pounding, and torture, brainwashers are able to make people believe that these people, i.e. the victims, saw and did things which they never did. As he had indicated in 1955, people could be brainwashed, he believed, by giving them an external goal or fact, then breaking them down through stress until they believed it. 2 years after the reissue of All About Radiation, on December 20th, 1969, Hubbard discussed brainwashing again, but added a twist. Now he defined it as the subjection of a person to a systematic indoctrination of mental pressure with a view to getting him to change his views or to confess to a crime. Doesn't that sound like the last 5 years throughout the world? Not only, therefore, did Hubbard believe that he knew how to force people to change their minds on vital issues, but also he thought that he could force, presumably false confessions, out of people by brainwashing them through severe stress. Again, these insights bore fruit in the RPF environment. Additional glimpses into Hubbard's knowledge about brainwashing comes from a March 1969 Scientology article in the organization's Freedom newspaper. At the time of initial publication, the article, entitled Brainwashing, did not reveal its author, and only after 1992 were researchers able to verify that it came from Hubbard himself. See Church of Scientology International, 1992, page 757. The article contained a long excerpt from a politically conservative writer, Robert G. Ridgway, and one section of Ridgway's commentary contained a section subtitled Nervous Breakdown. It described techniques designed to break down individuals and then build them up into the externally defined goals of the group. Guys always see it's the group, the group, the group, the group. The first part in the technique of brainwashing is an artificially induced nervous breakdown, which breaks the line with the individual's past experience and casts him adrift in a sea of suggestibility. This is brought on by exhaustion, sounds like the military, confusion, continuous physical pain, and fear and anxiety. This destroys human individuality and identity by fracturing fixed habit patterns and employing the useful fragments, cemented by suggestion, to rebuild an entirely different personality. Memory is diffused. Logic is confused and judgment is distorted in the absence of reference and discipline. The person has lost control of his mind. It is then that suggestion is most effective. The victim is grateful to be oriented again. He appreciates any purpose or direction given to him. He feels he has been led back to sanity, but in reality, his soul has been stolen. Sound like black magic to you guys? This was done to American fathers in Korea and their sons in Vietnam. Similar to Hubbard's writing in the previous decade, this article identified the necessity of destroying individuality, accomplished here through inducing nervous breakdowns. It makes me wonder about all the nervous breakdowns in Scientology. And then aligning the shattered personality with officially provided purpose and direction. This is also MK Ultra right here. Now they inject the program. Hubbard, we presume, had made a similar argument about breaking down people in the Brainwashing Manual of 1955. The manual stated that there is a curve of degradation which leads downward to a point where the endurance of an individual is almost at an end, and any sudden action toward him will place him in a state of shock. Similarly, a soldier held prisoner can be abused, denied, defamed, and degraded until the slightest motion on the part of his captors will cause him to flinch. Similarly, the slightest word on the part of his captors will cause him to obey or vary his loyalties and beliefs. Given sufficient degradation, a prisoner can be caused to murder his fellow countrymen in the same stockade. Experiments on German prisoners have lately demonstrated that only after 70 days of filthy food, little sleep, and nearly untenable quarters, that the least motion toward the prisoner would bring about a state of shock beyond his endurance threshold, and would cause him to hypnotically receive anything said to him. Thus, it is possible in an entire stockade of prisoners, to the number of thousands, to bring about a state of complete servile obedience, kind of like the last 5 years throughout the world, you guys. And without the labor of personally addressing each one, to pervert their loyalties and implant in them adequate commands to ensure their future conduct, even released to their own people. It's 1955. Again, techniques involving attempted attitude changes through severe stress became reality in the RPF, which Hubbard created less than 5 years after publishing an article on brainwashing that contained Ridgway's comments about nervous breakdowns. Organizational forerunners to the RPF. During the very period when Hubbard wrote about brainwashing in the late 1960s, he also established a number of formal structures within Scientology designed to both punish perceived deviants whose job performances were deficient and train people for necessary jobs that the organization needed. Having been at sea from late 1967, Hubbard's punishment and training programs reflected the needs and conditions of maritime life. On January 4th, 1968, for example, Hubbard created what he called the Mud Box Brigade, which was a punishment assignment to any Sea Org member when Hubbard determined was a freeloader who was loafing on post and drifting with the wind. The unsavory jobs involved cleaning the area where the ship's anchors dragged in mud, the mud boxes, along with fuel lines, water lines, bilges, etc. These were difficult, dirty, and somewhat dangerous assignments, but within a few years they would be taken over by inmates in the RPF's internal punishment program. The RPFs. Do you guys see all the layers? So many layers. Certainly by early 1969, Hubbard had in place two training projects, the Deck Project Force and the Purser's Project Force, but he abolished them on March 25, 1969. Apparently, the DPF had trained Sea Org members on various ship duties, and the PPF presumably trained people in areas of ship finance and supply. Likewise, sometime before early April 1972, Hubbard had a training program for household services called the Steward's Project Force. He also had a program called Estates Project Force, which, as we must reconstruct from a later document, did such work as painting and sweeping. Until the advent of the RPF, the EPF also received Sea Org members for what Scientology called retreading. These staff needed constant supervision, were making obvious problems, or were performing their jobs without enthusiasm, i.e., were suffering from roboticism. Apparently, however, Hubbard reinstituted the DPF because by early 1972, it had a function beyond mere training. In addition to new recruits, the DPF received Sea Org members who were questioning authority in the peculiar logic and language of Scientology. These people had interiorized, that is to say, the person is finding counterintention in the environment which coincides with his own. This is reasonableness. And his attention becomes directed to his own counterintention rather than to his objective. Said plainly, these people, children, were questioning aspects of Sea Org life and were finding things in the external world to reinforce their internal doubts. Consequently, the DPF was to rehabilitate and exteriorize their attention by getting them to do work assignments. Again, said plainly, the intent of the program was to get a person to stop looking inward and relearn to accept the orders that the organization and its leaders demanded. With this goal in mind, Hubbard imposed a system of rewards and punishments called ethics on people with the DPF. That paralleled the system under which ordinary Sea Org members operated. Overseeing DPF ethics was a person who had the title, the Deck Project Force, Master at Arms, and he or she was responsible for making ethics real to DPF members by removing counterintention and other intention from the area, and by getting each DPF member to crank out products with an honest, uptrending statistic. In other words, the MAA was to remove any ideas that were out of alignment with Scientology's goals. I lost my place, you guys, so I'm going to start in the middle here. In other words, the MAA was to remove any ideas that were out of alignment with Scientology's goals through the use of the reward and punishment ethics system. Lateness, poor work performance, negative attitude, etc. were out ethics. Actions that warranted the MAA to assign the offender to a lower ethics condition, which involved penalties on a gradient scale of severity. The offender, which could be a child, had to work off these hours, long penalties, or amends after the normal 8 to 10 hour workday. Supposedly, the completion of these amends taught people about the consequences of not showing continual increases in the output of their jobs, which supposedly was due to personal intentions that allegedly were out of harmony with Scientology's demands. In the DPF, MAA's ethics assignments we can hear the echo of Hubbard's ideas about brainwashing, which he first discussed in 1955 and elaborated upon in the late 1960s. This staff member was too physically wear down people when trying to get them to renounce their private doubts, with the goal of getting them to completely embrace the collective goals of the organization. You guys always notice it goes back to that every time. Apparently, the DPF's regime of hard work in harsh conditions continued into the early 1980s, since the account of Birgitta Dagnall about her time on the DPF in Denmark bears remarkable similarities to RPF accounts. According to her own statement, she was among the 82 former Guardian Office members sent into the Danish RPF by the new leadership of the Office of Special Affairs in 1982. The crowded conditions, the poor food, the exhausting hours, the assignments involving cleaning toilets, corridors, and hotel rooms, or some painting and construction work, were the same for RPF inmates in other parts of the world. So were the gangbang sec checks. That's a terrible, terrible name, which I discuss later. And the demand that we recognize that we really were the bad and evil, which she experienced during what she thought were going to be auditing sessions. The creation of the RPF. The RPF built directly upon the punitive, some might say brainwashing role that the DPF had developed. Hubbard's motivations for establishing the program in January 1974 included personal retaliation. Having gone ashore in late 1973 to ride his motorcycle on Tenor Life in the Canary Islands, Hubbard took a spill and was injured. Recovering on board his flagship, Hubbard blamed the accident on unnamed crew members, typical narcissist, whom he believed were not carrying out his orders with sufficient diligence. In response, he ordered the creation of the RPF, with the intention of assigning to it anyone who had a counter-intention to his orders or wishes, along with all troublemakers and backsliders. Researchers do not have copies of the first 3 flag orders establishing the RPF, but do have the 4th one, which is a May 30th, 1977, twice revised version of a January 7th, 1974 issue. Sometime between its inception and late May 1977, the RPF had assumed the punitive functions previously handled by the EPF, and presumably the DPF. Sea Org members entered the RPF if they had dramatic indicator reads, called rock slams, while being counseled or audited on Scientology's confessional and lie detector machine, called the E-meter, which gives readings about galvanic skin responses. Such indicator or needle jumps supposedly indicated a hidden evil intention on the subject or question under discussion or auditing. Others received RPF assignments for poor production on the jobs or posts, poor personality indicators, presumably such as depression, grumbling, and doubting. Hubbard on his techniques, and obvious troublemaking. In considerable detail, the RPF document laid out the framework of forcible confinement, physical and social maltreatment, intensive reindoctrination, enforced confessions that were and are central to the program's operation. Certain passages, for example, outline the basic rules about forcible confinement. Inmates could not leave the facility and could travel between buildings only when they were accompanied by security guards. Boards of Directors of the Churches of Scientology. Physical maltreatment occurred within the confines of sometimes demanding and dangerous work to which they were assigned. Specifically, inmates had to carry out 11 maintenance functions: interior and exterior building cleaning, bathroom cleaning, general painting, internal building renovations, storage, passageway and stairway cleaning, other large-scale projects outside of sleeping, kitchen or eating areas, garage cleaning, elevator and elevator shaft cleaning, engine room and boiler room cleaning, furniture setups for events, and garbage disposal. They also could receive special assignments from specific Scientology personnel, boards of directors of the churches of Scientology. They were supposed to get 7 hours sleep. Board of Directors of the Churches of Scientology, 1977, page 4. And they were allowed to call on a Scientology medical officer. That could be a kid, like Jenna Miscavige. Jenna Miscavige did that when she was a child. Who need not be a medical doctor, only if they were running a temperature or suffer an injury that requires medication or treatment. Inmates were allowed to eat normal meals unless doing so deprived Sea Org members who were not RPFers. Their use of bathrooms and showers was restricted, and at RPF expense, inmates were allowed a minimum number of circulating fans in their study and sleeping areas where there is no other circulation of air easily available. By adding together the time allotments that inmates had to perform various duties, we could deduce that each day people were supposed to receive 7 hours sleep, study and audit for 5 hours, take 1/2 hour for each of 3 meals, spend 30 minutes a day on hygiene, and perform physical work for 10 hours. Policies involving social maltreatment were numerous. Inmates had to wear black or dark blue boiler suits. Always remember that, you guys. They were barred from all normal social activities in the facility or the community, and any problems that the restriction might cause regarding non-Scientology commitments required an immediate report to superiors. As the policy succinctly stated, a member of the RPF is a member of the RPF and of nothing outside of it till released. Boards of Directors of the Churches of Scientology. You guys, wouldn't you love to know who was on those boards of directors? Huh? Depending upon inmate stage of progress, pay was either 1/4 or 1/2 the normal Sea Org rates, unless withheld or fined by a justice action. Inmates' sleeping quarters were isolated from those of other Sea Org members and were supposed to conform to fire, health, and safety regulations. Yeah, right away. Inmates could not speak to regular Sea Org members, public Scientologists, or members of the public unless they had to, in order to avoid impoliteness. Oh, they're impolite now. Spouse could have a conjugal visit with his or her partner 1 night a week in an authorized area, provided that the person's RPF progress was satisfactory. Oh, just conjugal visit, just like prison. LAPD is fine with all this stuff. Likewise, spouses could visit with their partners or school-aged children once daily during meals or at night. I don't think that happens. If their progress was satisfactory and they refrained from discussing their RPF situations, additional meal visits with preschool children could be arranged. Intensive study of Hubbard's ideology was built into the program, with inmates allotted 5 hours study or auditing. Some evidence indicates that RPF inmates in the mid-70s could complete the program in several months, but later accounts indicate that people frequently took over a year and served RPF sentences more than once during their Scientology careers. You also have to think about who's benefiting from them being in the RPF. A lot of people have died in there. The creation of the RPF's RPF. On April 24, 1974, a flag conditions order established the RPF's RPF. This program received people who were on the RPF, people like children, but not progressing satisfactorily or who thought that the assignment to the RPF was humorous, as Hubbard reported in his Management Technology Dictionary. The first RPF's RPF assignment was made because the person considered their RPF assignment amusing and an award and was therefore unable to recognize a need for redemption or any means to effect it, until such time as the person recognizes need and of their own self-determinism, requested to be included in the RPF redemption actions. Restriction applied. Okay, you guys, this is a very long article. I'm going to let you guys read the rest of it. Have a good night. I will leave a link in the description box.